I'm Marlene Whitaker, 70 years old, and the last time I saw my son before my husband's funeral, he walked out my front door without looking back. 5 years of silence followed. No calls, no visits, not even a Christmas card. On the morning we laid Thomas to rest, Daniel arrived in a pressed black suit, polished shoes, and an expression that didn't belong to the boy I raised. When the pastor closed his Bible, Daniel stepped forward not to speak about his father, but to hand me papers that would change everything. In that moment, I wasn't stunned by the demand itself. I was stunned by how familiar his distance felt. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And be sure to like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground against someone you never thought you'd have to fight. I've spent most of my life on this ranch, 1,200 acres of walnut trees, fenced pastures, and the kind of morning fog that hangs low like a quilt over the hills. Thomas and I started with almost nothing. A second-hand pickup, a few bags of seed, and enough determination to outlast the frost. While other couples traveled, we laid irrigation pipe under moonlight. While they went to the movies, we watched the sky, praying a sudden cold snap wouldn't kill our young trees. Over 43 years, we built something sturdy and true, not just for ourselves, but with the hope of passing it down. Daniel grew up here with dirt under his nails and sunlight in his hair, running barefoot through the groves and climbing fence posts taller than he was. I thought the ranch was in his blood, that the sound of the wind moving through the walnut leaves would always feel like home to him. For a while, it seemed that way until high school came. Chores went unfinished. His visits to the barn grew fewer, and his words about the farm shifted from ours to yours. By the time he left for college, it was clear he saw this place less as a legacy and more as something to leave behind. Thomas told me to give him space, to trust he'd find his way back. I tried. I kept his old room ready, stocked his favorite coffee in the pantry, and reread the last message he sent until the words lost their shape. He signed it with just his name: no love, no mom. Holidays came and went with an empty chair at the table, and though I never said it aloud, I kept waiting for the sound of his truck on the gravel drive. But the years kept adding up, and the only thing that returned was the quiet. Thomas buried himself in his workshop, building cedar boxes and repairing tools long past their prime. I tended the trees, watched the seasons turn, and told myself that family ties could stretch without breaking. Then came the night that proved me wrong. It was late October, the kind of evening when the wind slides under the eaves and the walnut leaves scratch against the roof. We had just finished supper when headlights swung too fast into the driveway, gravel spitting under the tires. I knew the sound of that engine even after all those years. The tires skidded over the gravel before the headlights even reached the porch, and the sound hit me like a memory I couldn't push away. Thomas set his mug down, his eyes narrowing toward the window. When the engine cut, a door slammed hard enough to echo off the barn wall. I opened the front door just as Daniel came into view, taller than I remembered, leaner. His shoulders set in a way that made him look older, but not necessarily settled. A dark leather jacket hung from his frame, something he would have teased his father for wearing back in the day. He didn't meet my eyes. His gaze went straight past me, finding Thomas in the kitchen doorway. I stepped aside, and he walked in without a word of greeting. The scent of cold air and engine oil trailed in with him, sharp against the warmth of stew still lingering in the kitchen. He didn't take off his boots. He didn't ask how we'd been. A manila folder landed on the table with a flat slap against the wood. "I've got an offer," he said, his voice even but rushed, as though rehearsed. Thomas picked it up, thumbing through the pages while I stayed where I was. Inside were property appraisals letters from an investor in New York and a proposal for turning a section of our ranch into some kind of retreat center. The numbers were tidy and convincing on paper, but the reality behind them sat heavy in the room. Daniel wanted to sell off a back section of orchard, split the proceeds, and walk away. Thomas didn't answer. He only glanced at me, then back at the folder, his jaw tight. Daniel began pacing his boots, scuffing the worn floorboards. He talked about bills, piling up, city life, costing more than he expected, debts that wouldn't wait. He said we were holding on to more land than we could manage, that it made sense to downsize. I told him no, that this ranch wasn't a pile of acres to barter. It was the work of a lifetime. I said we could find another way to help him, but selling wasn't an option. The air in the room seemed to narrow between us. Daniel's face flushed, his words sharpened, and he accused me of always siding with his father. He said we were selfish, that after all these years we owed him something. His hands trembled as he spoke, and before I could take another breath, the sharp crack of his palm met my cheek. The sound was smaller than I would have imagined, but it carried through every inch of the house. My skin burned, my ears rang. Thomas's chair scraped back hard, toppling over as he moved to stand between us. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked Daniel square in the eyes and told him it was time to leave. Daniel didn't argue. He turned, crossed the porch in long strides, and the slam of the front door was followed by the churn of tires spinning down the drive. I stayed by the table, pressing my palm lightly to my cheek, the sting already fading, but leaving something far heavier behind. Thomas picked up his mug from where it had landed on its side, set it upright, and held it in both hands for a long time before taking a sip. The next morning, without a word, Thomas began boxing up what was left of Daniel's things. Shirts folded into worn cardboard books, stacked without care, framed photos turned face down before they were wrapped. By sundown, the guest room was stripped bare and the door closed, as if no one had ever stayed there. Years passed in that silence. When word came that Thomas's health was failing, I never expected Daniel to appear. But on the morning of his funeral, the sound of unfamiliar tires found its way up our drive again. A black sedan rolled to a stop by the barn, too polished for these roads. Daniel stepped out cleaner cut than before, a black wool coat buttoned tight. Behind him, a blonde woman in heels picked her way across the grass, followed by a man carrying a slim briefcase. The three of them made their way toward the small group gathered by the orchard where Thomas's pine casket rested. They didn't join the circle. They stood apart until the service ended, then Daniel stepped forward. His hand didn't rest on the casket, his eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, he nodded once, like greeting a stranger, and the man with the briefcase handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a legal notice Daniel was claiming half the ranch, including the back orchard and the equipment we used to run it. He cited the absence of a public will declaring his right as an heir. I stayed still, the paper cool against my palms. The woman's small, measured smile felt deliberate, as though this moment had been mapped out in her mind and was unfolding exactly as she'd expected. Daniel said it was just business that we could settle quietly, and that there was no reason for it to turn ugly. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the documents in my hands by the grave of the man who had built every fence and planted every tree on this land. People who had come to stand with me now avoided my eyes. They drifted away in ones and twos, their footsteps muted by the grass. I sat on the weathered bench Thomas built years ago. The envelope still on my lap, the wind tugging at the hem of my coat. The casket was already lowered. The orchard stretched out behind it, rows of trees bare in the late spring chill. That night, the papers sat untouched on the kitchen table. I knew what they meant without reading them again. He wanted half of the land, half of the tools, half of the work Thomas and I had built across 4 decades. The next day, I drove down to see Howard Lane. He was retired now, the paint peeling on his old porch wind chimes, clinking above the steps. He didn't ask questions right away. He poured coffee, slid a mug across the table, and let me find the words. When I finally handed him the envelope, he read each page carefully. Then he asked when Thomas had last updated his will. I told him about the one he'd written 2 years earlier after his first surgery, tucked away in our fireproof box with the insurance papers and a few old letters. Howard said that was good. As long as it was signed, notarized, and clear, Daniel's claim wouldn't stand. But he warned me, claims could be contested, accusations could be made. We would have to be ready. I drove home after dark, the road empty, the air heavy with fog. In the office, I unlocked the fireproof box and pulled out Thomas's will. His handwriting was steady, deliberate. Every acre, every tool, every debt was left to me. Daniel's name wasn't written anywhere. I remembered Thomas sitting at the kitchen table, his back aching after a day in the field, telling me he wanted to be sure the ranch stayed whole. I slid the will back into place and reached for a folder I hadn't opened in years, my old journal. Flipping through the pages, I found the entry from that October night. Every word was there, the pacing, the words he used, the way his eyes slid away from mine, the sound of the door closing behind him. I copied that page and the will, sealing them in an envelope marked for Howard. If Daniel meant to take this to court, we would be ready. The first letter came 3 days after the funeral. The envelope was thick, my name printed in bold across the front, but there was no return address. Inside were copies of the same legal papers Daniel had handed me at the orchard, along with a formal notice of his intent to take the claim to court. There was no message, no apology, just signatures, filing dates, and deadlines. I set the pages down on the kitchen table and stared at them for a long moment before reaching for the coffee pot. I called Howard that afternoon. He arrived within the hour, his old canvas briefcase tucked under his arm. We spread the documents out on the dining room table, the same one where Thomas used to review seed orders in the winter. Howard's voice stayed even as he went through each clause. He pointed out vague language mistakes in the filing and sections that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. Still, he warned that even with Thomas's will in place, a contested claim could drag on and leave a shadow over the ranch. By the time Howard left that night, the papers were neatly stacked, my notes clipped to the top. I stayed up late in the office, scanning the journal page I had copied from that October night years ago. I wasn't planning to use it in court unless I had to, but I wanted it documented something more than memory if Daniel's behavior ever became relevant. The next morning, I drove into town for the first time since Thomas's service. The air was sharp with the bite of early spring, and the streets were busier than I expected. At the hardware store, just past the sacks of mulch and seed, I ran into Margie Henson. She had worked with us during harvest 1 year long before Daniel left for school. She took my hand gently, her eyes searching mine, and asked if it was true that Daniel had returned only to try and take the land. I told her I couldn't talk about it, and she nodded, her voice quiet, as she said she remembered him as a boy, polite, quick to help, the kind to carry groceries without being asked. I didn't know how to answer her, so I didn't. We stood there for a moment before parting ways, her hand lingering on my arm, a second longer than needed. I drove home with the truck bed full of supplies, the late afternoon light turning the fields gold. From the ridge near the house, I could see the orchard stretching in straight measured lines, each tree bare, but standing firm. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table again, the legal papers still in their stack at the edge. I understood now that this wasn't only about property lines and acreage. It was about the story of this place and who would have the final say in it. I had spent decades tending this land, alongside Thomas, watching it grow from a few saplings into a working ranch. I wasn't ready to see it reduced to a line item on someone else's ledger. A week later, the letter from the probate clerk arrived. The envelope was heavier than most, the court date printed in block letters on the inside page. I set it down beside the fruit bowl and stood at the window for a long time, watching the shadows stretch across the porch. Out past the fence line, the ribbons Thomas had once tied around trees to mark for blight were still there, moving slightly in the breeze. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake thinking about what Howard had said, that defending the will was one thing, but finding a way to close the door completely was another. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called Linda Barrett. She had worked for us during harvest seasons in the 80s before starting her own business, helping family farms protect their land. Her voice warmed when she recognized mine, and we spoke for more than 2 hours. I told her everything about Thomas's passing the will, Daniel's return, and the lawsuit. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked if I had ever considered placing the ranch into a legacy trust. I had heard of the idea before, but never looked into it seriously. Linda explained how it would work. The trust would hold the ranch in perpetuity, protecting it from private inheritance and ensuring it could never be divided or sold for profit. I could continue to live here and manage it as I always had, but when I was gone, it would remain in service of agricultural education, local programs, and preservation. Daniel would have no legal claim, not now, not ever. I asked her to send me everything she had, documents, case studies, the fine print most people skipped over. Over the next week, I read until my eyes ached. The idea made sense. It was clear it was final, and it meant the ranch would keep its purpose long after I was gone. When I met with Howard to discuss it, he was cautious at first, laying out possible complications, but as he read through the materials Linda had provided, he began to nod. He called it bold. He said it would draw attention, but he didn't say it was impossible. By the time we finished talking, I knew what I wanted to do. For the next 3 weeks, the paperwork moved forward in quiet, steady steps. I kept it to myself, offering polite answers when neighbors asked how I was holding up. Linda guided me through the process, making sure every form was correct, every signature in place. Howard reviewed each clause, checking it against state law. Old property maps were scanned, zoning codes verified. On a clear Thursday morning, I signed the final documents transferring the ranch into the Whitaker Agricultural Trust named for Thomas's mother, who had taught me how to tend the first row of walnut trees when I married into the family. From that moment, the land was no longer personal property. It belonged to its mission. It could not be split, sold, or claimed in any estate dispute. That afternoon, I walked to the east field. The fog was lifting, revealing the hills in slow layers. For the first time since Daniel had appeared at the funeral, the knot in my chest loosened. The orchard was still the air holding the faint scent of damp soil, and I knew the fight ahead would no longer be on his terms. The court date arrived on a Thursday in late spring. The sky was pale and overcast, and a light wind moved through the parking lot as I stepped out of my truck. I wore a navy dress and my mother's gold maple leaf brooch, the same one she'd given me when Thomas and I bought our first piece of land. Howard walked beside me carrying a slim leather folder that held everything we had prepared. Linda was there too, her beige coat pulled tight against the breeze, her flat shoes squeaking softly on the concrete as we headed toward the courthouse doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine cleaner and coffee gone cold. Daniel was already seated at the front with his lawyer, a young man who flipped through his notes without looking up. Daniel's suit was darker than the one he'd worn at the funeral. His hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at me when I took my seat across the aisle. The judge began with opening statements. Daniel's lawyer went first, speaking about birthright, about the bond between family and land, about the strain of estrangement. He painted Daniel as a man seeking fairness after years of distance, a son left out without reason. When it was Howard's turn, he didn't raise his voice or linger on emotion. He simply handed over the notarized will, the trust documentation, and the recorded statement Thomas had made confirming his intention to leave the ranch entirely in my care. Howard explained that the property in question was no longer subject to private inheritance. It now belonged to a legally recognized agricultural trust established to protect it from division or sale. He kept his tone, even his words precise, answering each of the judge's questions without hesitation. The judge reviewed the documents, asked for them to be entered into the record, and then said there was nothing further to consider. It was over more quickly than I expected. As the judge moved on to the next case, I glanced across the aisle. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing just slightly, but he didn't speak. He gathered his papers and stood his lawyer trailing behind him. Linda gave my hand a brief squeeze as we stepped into the hallway, then headed for her car. Howard walked with me to mine, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder for a moment before he turned away. At home that evening, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the quiet hum of the burner filling the kitchen. The orchard beyond the window was still the rows of trees casting long shadows as the sun dipped behind the ridge. I slept with the window open that night, the wind moving through the house in a way that felt steady, almost familiar. 2 weeks later, an envelope appeared between the storm door and the frame. There was no stamp, no return address. Inside was a letter in Daniel's handwriting, slanted quick like he'd written it all in one sitting. It wasn't an apology. He wrote that I had taken something that was meant to be his, that Thomas would have wanted him to have a part of the ranch. He said he had already taken out a loan, expecting to win the case, and was now left with nothing to fall back on. I folded the letter and slid it into my coat pocket without answering right away. That evening, I went up to the attic for the first time since Thomas passed. The space smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I pulled out a small tin where we'd kept some of Daniel's childhood drawing stick figures in wide fields, lopsided tractors, rows of trees that barely fit on the paper. I looked through each one slowly, then set them back in the tin and closed the lid. The next morning, I wrote my own letter. It was short. I told him I'd received his message, that I understood his anger, but that the land was no longer mine to give or his to take. I told him it had been preserved for something larger than both of us. I didn't ask him to come back, and I didn't offer anything else. A week later, I met Linda behind the equipment shed where she was showing 2 volunteers how to sort soil samples. The Trust's programs were starting to take shape. Local students had begun visiting on weekends, and there were plans for a workshop series in the new year. Linda asked if I would be willing to give a talk about walnut cultivation for the first seminar. I said yes. In the days that followed, I pulled Thomas's old notes from the office shelves and rewrote some of my own. I practiced in the mirror once or twice, the words feeling steadier each time. On the morning of the seminar, 14 people gathered in the barn, sitting on bales of hay with notebooks in their laps. They listened. They asked questions. They took notes. And when it was over, a young woman with dirt under her fingernails came up to ask if she could help prune next season. I told her she could start sooner. That night, I stood on the porch after everyone had gone, the air cooling, as the light faded. Out in the orchard, the branches shifted gently in the wind. The court case was finished, the trust was in place, and the ranch's work had begun to grow in a new direction. A little over 2 weeks after the seminar, just as the afternoons were starting to warm, there was a knock at the door near dusk. The light outside had turned amber, and the air carried the faint smell of turned soil from the lower fields. I expected one of the volunteers returning a tool, but when I opened the door, Daniel was standing there. His hands were in his jacket pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. His eyes met mine for only a moment before shifting toward the porch railing. I stepped aside without a word, and he walked in. The house was warm from the oven. I had been baking cornbread for the weekend's workshop. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same chair Thomas had always used, and rested his forearms on the wood. After a long pause, he reached into his coat and placed a folded sheet of paper in the middle of the table. "I'm dropping the appeal," he said quietly. His lawyer had told him there was no point in continuing. The trust made the land untouchable. He mentioned the loan he had taken out before the hearing, the house in Phoenix he had sold, and how he'd been staying with a friend. His voice carried no sharpness, just a kind of tired acceptance. I asked why he had come. He looked up then down again. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. "I thought you'd crumble after Dad died," he admitted. I didn't think you'd fight." He glanced around the kitchen, his eyes lingering on the chipped mug by the windowsill, the faded curtains, the stack of lesson folders near the back door. He asked if I had truly turned the ranch into a nonprofit. When I told him yes, he asked if that meant he'd never see a cent from it. I answered yes again. For a moment, he said nothing, then nodded slowly, as if letting the truth settle in. To my surprise, he asked if there was anything he could help with, something small, even sweeping the barn floor. I considered the question, thinking about all the versions of him I'd known. Finally, I told him there was a row of tools in the shed that needed sharpening, and some workshop chairs that needed sanding before winter cracked them apart. He stood, nodded again, and headed outside, without another word. I watched from the kitchen window as he crossed the yard. His steps were slow, deliberate, but they were his. In the days that followed, he started showing up in the mornings. Not every day, and not with any announcement, just quietly appearing, work gloves in hand. The first time he asked if the compost pile needed turning. The second time, he climbed a ladder to clear the shed gutters. I gave him small jobs, tasks that didn't require much conversation. He kept to the outer buildings and the orchard edges, never stepping into the house. The volunteers noticed his presence. They exchanged glances when he joined the afternoon cleanup, but no one asked questions. I didn't explain. The rhythm of the place went on as it always had, with tools being put away and gates latched at the end of the day. By mid-December, I began to see him taking more interest in the trust's work. One afternoon, I found him on the porch looking through a binder Linda had left a spring program outline for the workshops. When I stepped outside, he closed it carefully and asked if we still had the old soil pH tester from the 80s. I told him we did. That evening, after the volunteers had gone, he lingered in the barn and asked about Thomas's last harvest. It was the first time he had spoken his father's name since the funeral. He wanted to know how bad it had been, whether Thomas had suffered. I told him it had been slow, that some days were harder than others, but that Thomas had wanted to spend his final days here, not in a hospital bed. I said he had gotten his wish. Daniel stared at the floor for a long time before giving a small nod. Then he set down the rag he'd been holding and walked toward the shed. The next morning, a package arrived, addressed to me from a bookstore in New Mexico. Inside was a copy of a rare agricultural memoir Thomas used to mention one he'd never managed to find. Tucked inside the cover was a short note in Daniel's handwriting I remembered. I placed the book on the kitchen windowsill without saying anything about it. Over the next week, his visits became longer. I saw him walking with one of the younger volunteers through the north field, pointing toward the irrigation lines and explaining something. From a distance, I couldn't hear the words, but I could tell she was listening closely. When they passed the tool shed, I caught the sound of her laughter. That evening, I sat by the fireplace, the book from Daniel still on the sill. Outside, the wind moved through the orchard, the sound steady and low. There was no talk of forgiveness between us, no declarations. But something in his manner had shifted. By the start of January, frost settled deep into the soil, slowing the pace of the ranch. Most mornings were quiet, marked by the sound of boots on gravel or the thud of feed bins closing. Daniel was around often enough that his absence now felt unusual. One afternoon, I found him with Nora, a high school volunteer in the younger section of the orchard. He was showing her how to trim at the right angle and check for disease in the branch tips. I watched for a while before approaching. When he saw me, he stepped back and let Nora finish the cut on her own. Later that day, a folder appeared on the porch table. It was from Linda, an application to feature the ranch in a rural revitalization program's spring report. Inside was a photograph taken during the fall harvest workshop. People were gathered around tables of soil samples, and in the corner of the frame was Daniel carrying a crate of tools. That night, I wrote a short piece for the application about the trust the ranch and what it meant to repurpose something broken rather than discard it. Linda sent it to the board, and within days, she told me it had been accepted. When I handed Daniel a copy of the draft, he read it in silence, his fingers resting on the page long after his eyes had finished. He set it down carefully and stayed for dinner that evening for the first time in years. We didn't talk about the past or make plans for the future. We just shared a meal, the heater ticking in the background, and the same radio station Thomas used to play filling the quiet. It wasn't closure, but it was steady. By early spring, the orchard began to wake. Pale green buds lined the branches, and the damp soil carried that familiar scent of thaw. The Trust's programs were in full swing now, weekend workshops, pruning lessons, and soil testing in the barns. Linda brought in a small film crew one Saturday to document the progress. They filmed students walking the orchard rows, volunteers checking irrigation lines, and tables of labeled soil samples. I stayed mostly in the background, moving tools and keeping the work flowing, but I noticed Daniel more than once in the edges of their shots. He didn't shy away from the camera, though he never sought it out. Some afternoons, he sat with the younger volunteers by the barn, sharing coffee and stories. His voice had lost some of the tightness it once carried. Now and then, I'd hear his laugh, quiet but genuine enough to hold the moment. In May, I planted a new section in the southern plot. The sun was sharp that morning, the breeze steady, and the ground gave easily under the spade. Daniel arrived partway through, his jacket slung over his shoulder, and without a word, picked up another spade and worked the next row. We didn't talk, just moved at our own pace, the rhythm of the work setting its own kind of conversation. Later that week, Linda stopped by with updated enrollment numbers for the summer programs. The interest was higher than expected, enough that she was considering a second session in July. While we reviewed the forms at the kitchen table, Daniel came in from the barn, carrying a bucket of tools. He paused, glanced at the paperwork spread out, then asked if the expansion meant more volunteers would be needed. Linda nodded, explaining that a few more hands would help with instruction and maintenance. He didn't say much else, but I noticed him listening until he stepped back outside. The following Saturday, he showed up earlier than usual and spent the morning tightening fence lines along the east pasture. Around midday, he joined a small group clearing debris from one of the older storage sheds. The work was slow, but he stayed until the job was done. No one asked him to. He just kept moving from task to task, never lingering too long in conversation, but not avoiding it either. One afternoon in late May, a package arrived from the revitalization program. Inside was a printed copy of their spring report featuring the ranch as a case study. The photos showed volunteers in the orchard, students in the barn, and one image of Daniel standing beside a table of pruning shears. He was looking down at the tools, his hands resting on the edge of the table. The caption beneath the image read simply, "Hands-on learning at Whitaker Agricultural Trust." I set the report on the porch table where he'd be likely to see it. The next day he stopped by after lunch, saw the report, and picked it up without a word. He flipped through until he found the photo, studied it for a moment, then set the booklet down. "Looks good," he said, before heading out toward the south field with a coil of wire over his shoulder. As June came on, the days grew warmer and longer. Daniel's visits were still irregular, but more often than not, he was there when a project needed doing. Sometimes he worked with the volunteers, other times on his own, repairing a gate latch or checking the drip lines in the orchard. There was no discussion of the past, no questions about what might come next, but the pattern was steady enough to notice. One evening, after most everyone had gone, I walked the rows to check the younger trees. Daniel was already there, leaning on a post, watching the last light fall across the hills. He didn't turn when I approached, just said, "They're growing fast this year." I agreed, and for a while, we stood there in the quiet, the only sound, the soft rustle of leaves. Eventually, he pushed off the post and said he'd see me in the morning. By the first week of July, the summer heat had set in the air, thick and still in the afternoons. The Trust's programs continued on, and Linda began planning the fall schedule. She asked if I would consider teaching a longer course on orchard management. I said I'd think about it. Daniel, overhearing from the next table in the barn, suggested adding a section on equipment maintenance. Linda smiled, said it was a good idea, and made a note in her ledger. That evening, I found a small stack of sharpened tools lined neatly in the shed, the edges glinting in the low light. There was no note, but I knew whose work it was. It was early July when the small group gathered for the Trust's summer workshop. 14 people sat on bales of hay inside the barn, notebooks, open pens poised. I stood at the front, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on me. It wasn't pride I felt, just a steady calm I hadn't known I'd lost. The words came slowly at first, then with more ease as I talked about soil cycles, pruning techniques, and the rhythm of the seasons. A few asked questions, some taking notes carefully. Afterward, a young woman named Nora approached me. She had dirt under her nails and a nervous smile that reminded me of someone just beginning to find their footing. She asked if she could start helping with pruning right away rather than waiting for the official season. I told her she could begin the next morning. That evening, as the sun slipped low behind the hills, I found a folder left on the porch table. It was from Linda, marked with the seal of the Rural Revitalization Board. Inside was a formal request to submit the ranch as a case study for their spring report. They'd seen the data, the steady growth of volunteers and students, the new programs taking root. Tucked in the folder was a photo taken during the fall harvest workshop, a candid shot capturing the barn tables lined with soil samples and people gathered in quiet focus. In one corner of the frame was Daniel carrying a crate of tools. His face was turned just halfway toward the camera, eyes downcast, but steady. I stared at that photo long after the sun had disappeared. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a short piece about the Trust, about the work we'd done to preserve the land, and about what it meant to take something broken and give it new purpose instead of discarding it. I sent the draft to Linda, who forwarded the edited version to the board. A few days later, she told me it had been accepted for publication. When I handed Daniel a copy, he read it without speaking. His fingers rested lightly on the page, even after his eyes had stopped moving. Then, for the first time in years, he stayed for dinner. We ate quietly in the kitchen, the heater ticking softly in the background, the same radio station Thomas used to play drifting through the room. There were no apologies, no conversations about the past or the future. Just the sound of forks against plates and the dogs sleeping by the door. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't closure, but it was steady. The ranch settled into its summer rhythm as the days stretched longer and warmer. The trees wore fresh leaves and the soil felt soft under my hands again. Daniel was here more than he had been in years, not every day, but often enough that his absence was noticeable. He still kept to the edges, working quietly with the volunteers, or fixing what needed fixing without much talk. There was no grand reconciliation between us, no sweeping words or promises. Instead, there was a slow rebuilding piece by piece in the spaces we shared without forcing them. One evening, we sat down for dinner for the first time in a long while. The dogs dozed by the door, the heater ticked softly, and the radio played a familiar station Thomas had loved. We didn't speak of the past or what might come next. We simply ate the steady rhythm of the meal filling the room. It wasn't forgiveness, not in any neat or dramatic sense, but it was enough to soften the ache I'd carried for years. I realized that some wounds don't close the way we hope. Some scars don't fade, and some silences linger longer than we want. But even so, they can become quieter, less sharp. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land anymore. It was a part of me rooted deep in my bones, shaped by years of care and hard work. And now it had begun to hold new life again, even if not the one I once imagined. Looking out over the rows of walnut trees, I understood that what mattered most wasn't who held the papers or claimed the ground. It was the story we told about this place, about resilience, about standing firm when the world felt uncertain. The trust ensured the ranch would continue not just as property, but as a living testament to the hands that shaped it and the community it would serve. I've learned that justice isn't always about loud victories or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's about quietly protecting what's precious, about setting boundaries that preserve dignity and hope. It's about knowing when to let go of what no longer serves and when to hold tight to what still grows. If this story has touched something in you, if you've faced moments where standing up meant standing alone, or if you've had to rebuild your peace from the pieces left behind, you're not alone. Sometimes healing comes in small, steady steps, in the daily work of care and patience. Thank you for listening. If you'd like, share your story or a moment when you found strength in silence in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing. Quiet courage deserves to be heard.